Hey there, I'm G, and welcome to the next level, and it's time for another episode of Console Consultation, where I take a look at new retro-themed video game consoles, give it an unboxing, or thorough review, and determine whether or not it's really worth your time. And folks, I got a very, very special one for you all today. This is the new Sega Genesis Mini, or Mega Drive Mini if you're in Japan or in the PAL territories, and I've been so dying for almost an entire year to get my hands on this. This is Sega's official foray into the micro console market, similar to the NES Classic and the PlayStation Classic. So you know how it's going to be, folks. We're going to give a full review of the unit, do a quick unboxing, tear down the entire games list, and just determine whether or not it's worth your time. So without further ado, let's do it to it. Alright, so here it is, folks, in all of its glory, the Sega Genesis Mini. I've been so dying to dig into this guy, so let's go ahead and do a real quick unboxing before we dig into the software and the games itself. So as you can see, this is the US Genesis Mini model, and it looks pretty much just like the box for the original Model 1 Sega Genesis, even with the additional, including Sonic the Hedgehog for the pack-ins that came in back in the day. I just love the style of it. It's super faithful. It's even gotten the Genesis 30th anniversary emblem there, which that's actually really, really cool. So then you see at a glance on the side basically what it includes, and also on the top there, more information. Very cool, very cool. And on the back it has at a glance all the games that actually comes with it. I love how they put at the top Echo the Dolphin and Castle of Illusion, mainly because those two games, Echo's kind of spotty on what Genesis Classics collections actually are included. It missed the last one. And Castle of Illusion, it's a first for either that or World of Illusion to come on the Genesis. And of course the two bonuses, the Darius game that's actually made specifically for the Genesis Mini, and then Tetris, which I have quite a bit to say about Tetris, but we'll get to that as it comes. But yeah, that's what the box looks like. There we go. And let's go ahead and dig right in. Open this bad boy up. So here's all that it comes with. I love how the inner linings also have the grid too. Just the attention to detail is just awesome in this thing. So here's what's basically inside the box firsthand. Now I know what's in here, so let's go ahead and knock this out of the way. So this is the unit itself. Alright, I love how it has a little window on the back of the box to show the serial number. Again, very old school. I love that. So pop this open. Right, and now, yeah, it is so beautiful. Sega just absolutely killed it with how the system looks. I mean, take a look at it. It pretty much looks just like the original Genesis. It's got the high definition graphics, the 16-bit in your face. It's got the volume control knob, the power button, the reset button. It's so super clean. And then it's got two USB ports on the front, similar to the two controller ports on the original system. The cartridge slot does open up. I mean, you can't really put anything in there unless you have the plastic Tower of Power that Japan got that we can't buy, which yeah, that doesn't really sit super well with me, but that's okay. That's okay. And then you can actually open it up, and then you look on the back. It even has the ventilage spots just like the original Genesis, and you can pry this open for the slot for the Sega CD compartment, which of course it's all aesthetics, it's all for show, but just the sheer fact that they thought of that is just awesome, and I absolutely love it. So, and of course the volume knob does toggle up and down too, but you can't actually plug headphones into it. The power light does turn on whenever you turn the system on, and that's your power switch. And then the reset button, which brings you back to the main menu whenever you're actually playing it on the game. So very, very cool. So that's the system. And here, take a quick glance at what it looks like compared to the original Genesis Model 1. Heck, even up against the USB hub that I got from Fangamer a while back. It just shows how faithful both of those are. And then, of course, the at-games one that we shouldn't really talk about. But this is really, really cool. So once again, Sega, just kudos for just doing a wonderful job on the presentation of it. And then it's got your HDMI connection for 720p playback and micro USB connection, which you can only use to connect to a USB on your TV, or if you have a power adapter, which Sega, again, another good job here, they actually thought to include a USB power adapter. So you don't necessarily need to go hunt for one for your cell phone. If only other companies actually thought to do that, Sony had thought to actually include that with their system. That couldn't have cost them any more than a couple of bucks for that, seriously. So now, in cords, so you got HDMI cord, nice. micro USB. I'm not really going to use these because I have so many micro USBs and HDMIs all over the place, so I'm just going to leave those sealed. And then next up, let's dig in to the controller. Now, I know the unfortunate thing about the American version of and the PAL version too, of the Sega Genesis Mini and the Mega Drive Mini is that it only comes with a 3-button controller, which, I mean, I understand that because it comes with Street Fighter 2 and a couple of other games that are enhanced by the 6-button, like Beyond Oasis, but just because this is supposed to be a throwback to the original Sega Genesis and the original Mega Drive system, which came with the 3-button controller, and you would have to buy your 6-button controller separate. So yeah, it's a bummer, but it also kind of makes sense. But the real question is, how does it feel? Now, to me, it feels almost just like an original Sega Genesis controller. The D-pad feels just right, the buttons are nice and clicky, the start button works. It's just super comfortable like a regular 3-button Sega Genesis controller. Now, I just realized I unfortunately don't have a working original 3-button Sega Genesis controller, but I do have the one that came with my JVC Xi, which pretty much used the same mold as the original Genesis, so feeling it in comparison to this controller, it's almost spot on. And I know some people who actually got like their review units and however had their issues with their controllers. This one I didn't have a single problem with during my entire time of testing. So yeah, that's it. That's the 3-button controller in a nutshell. And of course, there are 2 of them. So you've got 2 of them in the box. And there we go. There's the second one. Nice, nice. Pretty much the exact same thing, so don't need to dig any further into that. And then last but not least is the instruction manual, which once again basically packages how to utilize the system in itself. So yeah, that's what's in the box. And sure, absolutely beautiful. Again, excellent job to Sega for really knocking it out of the park in the packaging for this one. So that's enough of that. Let's go ahead and dig into the system itself. So now you've seen what's in the box and the hardware itself, before we get to the game breakdown, let's talk about the software and the emulation. When you boot up the Genesis Mini, you're greeted with a slick interface in which the background is reminiscent of the classic Genesis grid, with all the games having their respective US box arts, and I'm sure it's correct across all 4 regions of the Mega Drive Mini. You're also hit in the face and in the feels with a fantastic medley of classic Genesis music from various games that was arranged by the mastermind Yuzo Koshiro, which includes Sonic, Thunder Force, Comic Zone, Phantasy Star, and many others. When you hear it, try to guess them all. The game also uses the familiar Streets of Rage menu sound effects for the Mini's menu, which that's pretty cool. You can sort the games on the main menu by release date, alphabetical order, genre, or by the game's number of players. For my game breakdown, I'll be going through them alphabetically. Every game has a short bio and the familiar Genesis box icons letting you know the genre of the game, and if it has multiplayer options, which is a really nice touch. In the settings, you can alter your language and visual options, which include the choice of playing in the original 4:3 full frame or in 16:9 stretched widescreen, you know, if that's your bag. Applying a CRT filter, which is kind of cool, and screen border options for full frame playback, which include this Sonic boombox border, a more subtle blue border, or to have no border at all. You know what, and I'll take the blue border, because to be honest, Sonic's face on the other border is kind of distracting. While playing, you can hold down the start button or press the mode button if you have a 6-button controller to bring up the in-game menu, which allows you to save 4 save states for each game and load them up at any time. This super comes in handy, especially for games like Kid Chameleon that are tough to get through in one sitting, or games like Shining Force to have dedicated save points. And forget that, you can save anytime now. You can also do a soft reset on the game from here and return from the main menu, and you can access this menu by pressing the reset button on the Genesis Mini itself. So that's about it for the OS interface and the options. But here's the real question. How is the emulation? As you may already know, Sega's previous Genesis microconsoles were made by AtGames, a rather infamous company known for making shoddy Sega emulation boxes for several years. Thankfully, Sega wised up to their poor performance and kicked them to the curb in favor of hiring M2 to handle the emulation for the Genesis Mini, which also handles the Sega Ages ports on the Nintendo Switch. And I am pleased to say that, ladies and gents, we finally have an official Sega Genesis microconsole with emulation that's pretty much spot on. Through my playtime with the Genesis Mini, which was a lot, and honestly why this video is coming so late, sorry about that, is because I just couldn't put it down. But also in my playback, I hardly caught any kind of noticeable input lag. Though I'm sure if you have a tester or some sort of device to measure it, you'll find some, but to me, on my Sony LED TV, controller inputs felt accurate. Games like Sonic and Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine that require precise timing just felt right. And unlike the previous AtGames Genesis Flashback, or even the recent Sega Genesis Classics collection, which I noticed the Nintendo Switch version in particular has noticeable input lag, at least when the console is docked. Displaying in 720p, the colors on the games in the Genesis Mini are accurate to the original games and the sprites look super sharp. No blurriness, no added glitches or any nonsense. These games look pretty much like you remember them. Here's a few comparisons. Take a look at Sonic here on the Genesis Mini compared to an actual Genesis using HD Retrovision component video cables. It's pretty close, don't you think? Now look at it compared to last year's Genesis Classics collection on the Xbox One. The Genesis Mini still looks better to me, even if it's only minuscule in this case. Now check out Sonic on the Genesis Mini compared to the AtGames Genesis Flashback HD. Yeah. Huh. Why did I buy this thing again? But the big question is, how do the games sound? Sound emulation is something that the previous Genesis microconsoles and disc compilations just couldn't seem to ever get right. From minor differences to big failures, it always seems to be a tough task to perfectly get sound emulation from the Mega Drive. But I'm also delighted to say that M2 did the Genesis right here on the Mini. Almost. Overall, my one major complaint across the board in the audio emulation on the Mini is that the music seems to sound a bit scratchier than I remember. It's not a huge deal, but it is noticeable in some games more than others. This is what the intro music for Alex Kidd sounds like on an original Genesis. Now here's what it sounds like on the Genesis Mini. If you listen closely after each stop in the song, you can hear it. Again, your mileage may vary on this, and it's definitely not a make or break thing. The last Genesis Classics collection on the consoles had a bit of an issue with music and sound effects and some games not sounding right. Now, I'm not sure how it sounds on Steam, but at least on consoles, most particularly Kid Chameleon, the music seems to completely lose its beat at times. Listen. So overall, M2 really nailed it with the emulation on the Genesis Mini. However, there are two big flaws that I noticed. I chose Kid Chameleon to feature here because for some reason the tempo of the music is inconsistent on the Mini. The gameplay's fine, but the music is so erratic that it can be distracting. I don't know how they missed this in testing. And for some reason the volume of the audio in Wonder Boy and Monster World is much louder than the rest of the games in the lineup. Weird. But kudos to M2 for a job well done here. You can rest easy that the games you grew up with and hopefully still love today look, sound, and play just as you remember them. Alright, now let's break down the entire Genesis Mini library from A to Z. I'll give my quick thoughts on each of the games and whether or not they should have been included. So, here we go. First up, Alex Kidd and the Enchanted Castle. Oh, good old Alex Kidd. Though I'm a fan of Alex Kidd, to me, aside from High Tech World, Enchanted Castle is unfortunately his worst game. Yes, it's a very important game for the history of the Genesis, but it's just not all that great. I understand dying in one hit is normal for Alex Kidd, but with his terrible attack range in this one, it's just frustrating and not all that fun to play. His Master System games, especially Alex Kidd and Shinobi World, are much better. However, you gotta love that Janken Pon theme. I swear I need to make that my ringtone someday. Next, Alicia Dragoon. I got so hyped when I saw that Alicia Dragoon made the cut for the Genesis Mini, as I've always felt that it's one of the most underrated action games on the system. You control Sorceress Alicia and her multitude of dragon familiars that each have their own special abilities to take on the bad guys, avenge her father, and save the world. This game is awesome, folks, and I will definitely be giving it a full review for the treasure chest in the future, but be sure to not miss it on the Mini. It's fantastic. Next, Altered Beast. You know the deal on Altered Beast, folks.
Rise from your grave. Power up.
Although it arguably hasn't aged super well compared to Sega's other iconic franchises, you just can't do a Genesis compilation without Altered Beast. It plays fine, it sounds fine, it's fine. And that's about it. Next, Beyond the Oasis. Beyond the Oasis, aka The Story of Thor, is a fantastic Legend of Zelda style adventure game from Ancient, the team behind Streets of Rage 2, with of course Yuzo Koshiro at the helm. As you trek through your adventure, you and your magical armlet collect various spirits to summon and can use their powers to solve puzzles and defeat enemies. To me, this is one of the most visually stunning games on the system, and Beyond the Oasis plays just as good as it looks. While people may pass it off as just another average Zelda clone, pay no attention to that noise. It's a wonderful game that I feel many people are still kind of sleeping on today, and it's well worth being included on the Mini. Next, Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. One of my all-time favorite games on the Genesis and easily my favorite Disney game of all time. Just the sheer fact that Disney worked along with Sega to make this happen on the Genesis Mini is so awesome. Castle of Illusion may not have a whole lot of bells and whistles, they were saved for the sequel, which I'll talk about later, but it's one of the most solid, polished, and fun platformers on the entire system, and the graphics and music are stunning as well. Major props to Sega and Disney for making this happen, but it really makes me wonder why an even bigger Disney licensed Genesis game didn't make the cut for the Mini. Next, Castlevania Bloodlines. Well, Konami did it, folks. They jumped on board for the Genesis Mini and they had to put Castlevania Bloodlines on here. Beyond it being the only Castlevania game on the Genesis, it's one of my favorite games in the franchise. It's a nice throwback to its NES roots with it being released after Castlevania 4 on the Super NES, yet felt fresh enough to be its own thing. And it also does some cool graphical tricks that we hadn't seen on the Genesis before. It's just so stylish and so much fun. So glad to see it finally get into the hands of people to play on their TVs without shelling out buku bucks for a physical copy. Next, Columns. This is another game that I have a heavy heart for, and I'm sure its fans will give me some hate for saying this, but I'm just not a fan of columns. You line 3 gems of any color in a row or diagonally, and don't let the gems reach the top. Just like Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle, yeah, it deserves to be on here. I mean, mainly because it was Sega's successful alternative to Tetris at the time. It works well enough, and I'm not saying it's a bad game at all, but it just doesn't excite me. Sorry, guys. Next up, Comix Zone. Man, talk about a game that was way ahead of its time. Comix Zone was a 2D brawler on the Genesis that was so groundbreaking in how your hero, Sketch Turner, is trapped in his own comic book and must fight his way out. Yeah, it's brutally hard, and the aesthetics make everything about the game, but the outstanding graphics and animation, particularly the comic book sound effects that pop up when you land big hits, the trademark 90s grunge soundtrack, and excellent level design round out a truly iconic Genesis title that perhaps came out too late in the system's life.
Well done, Turner. Oh yeah.
Next, Contra Hardcore. I love Contra. And when I was a kid and Contra Hardcore came out on the Genesis, it was like my dreams came true, and this felt no different when I saw it make the cut for the Genesis Mini. Like Comix Zone, it is a damn tough game, but it's never unfair and is always worth trying again. Where Hardcore shines is in its sheer wackiness of the action. Being able to select characters for the first time in its series, each with their own weapons and feel, the outstanding soundtrack. Man, I could go on and on about how you should play it, but like Castlevania Bloodlines on the Genesis Mini, now you can too without breaking the bank. Next, Darius. Now this is freaking cool. This is a brand new port of Taito's arcade classic shoot 'em up Darius, which was made specifically for the Genesis Mini, as the only game in the series to come to the Genesis was Sagaya, aka Darius 2, in 1991. And from what I gather, it's a faithful port of the arcade classic. Actually, take a look at it in comparison to the PC Engine port Super Darius. It looks pretty close, doesn't it? Yeah, the game is super hard and there are no continues, but it's still a really nice added touch to the Genesis Mini, one that I don't think anyone saw coming. Next, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine. A Western Sonicized version of Compile's classic puzzle game, Puyo Puyo, Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine was definitely more my speed than Columns was. And I'm not just saying that as a Sonic fan, but the game is just more fun. The two-player action is a lot more intense too. The soundtrack is more pumping and more epic than you'd think for a puzzle game. And once you start connecting and popping those beans, you can't stop. I'm glad to see that Puyo Puyo has become an important franchise for Sega today. And it could be said that, at least in the West, it started with Mean Bean Machine. Next up, Dynamite Headdy. One of the stranger games in the portfolio of legendary developer Treasure, and that really is saying a lot. I used to question why Dynamite Headdy made past Genesis compilations while Gunstar Heroes and other games didn't. But the more I played a charming platformer where you play as a puppet where you can lose your head, in favor of special heads with unique power-ups, I feel that it deserves it. As I said, it's really strange at times, but it's incredibly imaginative, so super colorful, and it's just a ton of fun to play, especially for its epic boss fights, which, if you're familiar with Treasure games, you should definitely expect that. Next up, Earthworm Jim. Another game that I definitely didn't expect to make it to the Genesis Mini, but what a fantastic grab it is. If you've never played Earthworm Jim before, you're an everyday earthworm that accidentally lands in a supersuit, has a ray gun for a weapon, and treks through one of the most charmingly hilarious platformers of the 16-bit era. Earthworm Jim is certainly integral to the Genesis, as it packs in outstanding animation, brilliant level design, and introduced one of the coolest characters of that generation. Excuse me, the Groovy Est. That's better.
Oh yeah.
Next, Echo the Dolphin. If you've known me for a while, you probably already know that I respect the hell out of Echo the Dolphin. It's a vital franchise for Sega at the time, as it's an experience that really is like no other on the Genesis. But that being said, I'm still not a big fan of the gameplay. It's a beautiful, imaginative game, but it just moves so slowly and is quite cryptic at times, and I'm wandering around just trying to figure out what to do next. But it certainly deserves its spot here on the Mini, and I'm glad to see it return after being skipped for the last Genesis Classics collection, but it's just not for me. Next, Eternal Champions. I already went into detail about Eternal Champions in the Sega Genesis Classics Level 10 video I made last year, so I'll keep it short. Eternal Champions was Sega's serviceable alternative to Mortal Kombat that elicits a peculiar response among fighting game fans. Yeah, it doesn't really hold up well today, especially against its superior sequel on the Sega CD, but it's still nice to see it make it to the Genesis Mini. And for those out there that were saying that Mortal Kombat should have been included instead of this, do you really think Sega wanted to get a mature rating for the Genesis Mini? That certainly worked out well for the PlayStation Classic, didn't it? No. Next, Ghouls and Ghosts. During the early stages of the Genesis' life, Sega made several excellent ports of Capcom arcade classics, such as Forgotten Worlds, Mercs, and this one, Ghouls and Ghosts. I have a love-hate relationship with the Ghosts and Goblins series, as many of them are just too frustrating to be fun, but this iteration of Ghouls and Ghosts proves to be a lot fairer and easier to pick up and play. It looks fantastic, and plays pretty much perfectly as well, so great job on Sega for including this on the Mini. Of course, there is one more legendary Capcom arcade conversion included here that makes me very happy, but we'll get to that. Next, Golden Axe. I just mentioned how Eternal Champions doesn't really hold up well today, and I bet I'm gonna get some heat for this, but I could say the same about Golden Axe. Yes, it's iconic, it deserves to be here, but to me it's just so slow and clunky today compared to other beat-em-ups on the Genesis like Streets of Rage or even the surprisingly good Mighty Morphin Power Rangers movie game. You can't deny its epic atmosphere, characters, and magic attacks though. It makes me think that maybe Golden Axe 2 might have been a better choice for the Mini than the first game. Just not the third game though. There's a reason why that one was left overseas, folks. Next, Gunstar Heroes. If you're not familiar with it, imagine a Contra-style game with a touch of crazy anime flair and even crazier boss battles, and you get Treasure's Gunstar Heroes. If you've never played Gunstar Heroes before, you're in for a real treat, and you'll see why Sega holds this series so dearly. It's crazy the amount of pulse-pounding moments it holds with unique boss fights, slick presentation, and nail-biting action, all with very minimal slowdown. Although I noticed that this game in particular seemed to have very little bass in the music than I remember. Weird. It's an incredible action game that has to be experienced if you haven't yet. Next, Kid Chameleon. When I was a kid, there weren't many games that I was hyped to play on the Genesis as much as I was for Kid Chameleon. And still to this day wonder why Sega never made a whole series out of it, but its legacy still lives on the Genesis Mini. It might seem like an everyday platformer at first, but as you control the kid and collect various helmets that give you special abilities in each level, it's so cool. But as I said, each level, all 103 of them. Yeah, thank goodness for save states now, yes? Like I already mentioned, the emulation on Kid Chameleon is a little bit spotty on the Genesis Mini, but it's a shame that this seems to have been missed in testing because Kid Chameleon is definitely a game that you should think of when you think of the Genesis. Next, Landstalker. One of two isometric action RPG games on the Genesis Mini, this gem from Climax has some hardcore fans, and I'm so glad to see that Sega has been giving it more love in recent years. It's a lot more lighthearted than the other adventure games on the Genesis Mini, and while it's not without its problems, mainly the collision detection and frustrating platforming, it's so much fun to figure out its puzzles, and to play through the charming story. Fun tidbit, if you ever played Dark Savior on the Saturn, or Time Stalkers on the Dreamcast, they're spiritual successors to Landstalker. Next, Light Crusader, the other isometric action RPG on the Mini. This one coming from the masterminds of Treasure. Light Crusader came out around the same time as Comix Zone, but it didn't get anywhere near the fanfare. Which is a shame, because it's quite good. In fact, personally, I prefer it over Landstalker, and I'm glad to see it finally getting some love from Sega lately. It's a visually exciting game too, with an absolutely wonderful soundtrack. I particularly love the shop and main menu theme. Exquisite. Next up, Mega Man The Wily Wars. Ooh, this is a huge grab for the Genesis Mini, especially for us in the US, as prior to the Mini, unless you emulated it, the only way you could play Mega Man The Wily Wars was through the Sega channel back in the day, or by shelling out big bucks to get a physical copy. Longtime fans of my channel may remember my story of how I got my PAL copy of The Wily Wars, and I'm delighted to say that for the Genesis Mini, M2 adapted the game to run in 60Hz for US NTSC TVs. Now, please correct me if I'm wrong in the comments, but to me, this version on the Mini feels much more responsive than the actual physical version I own, and it's not just because of the 60Hz playback. I can do the inch now, and trust me, anyone who's familiar with the original Mega Man games knows that this helps the game a lot. As for the game itself, I'll save my detailed thoughts for a future Treasure Chest episode, but unless you just aren't a fan of Mega Man, it's absolutely worth your time here. Talk about a killer app for the Mini. Next up, Monster World 4. Since we're on the subject of killer apps, this is another game that I got super hyped for when it got announced for the Mini. Monster World 4 originally was released for the Mega Drive in Japan in 1994, but never got a Western release until it was translated and released for the Wii Virtual Console, Xbox Live Arcade, and PlayStation Network in 2012. But to me, this is really the best Monster World game out of all of Sega's outings with the franchise, as it plays faster, is oozing with style and charisma, and has a near-perfect level of challenge. I've always wanted a copy of Monster World 4, and I still hope to someday, but for now, this definitely works, and you should absolutely give it a play on the Mini. I even named my last adopted cat after their main character, Asha. Asha, look this way, Asha. Next, Phantasy Star 4. The best RPG on the Genesis? Definitely. And it's an absolute need to be included on the Genesis Mini. While I may veer to Phantasy Star 2 for nostalgic reasons, Phantasy Star 4 just absolutely nails it on nearly every level for an epic RPG. The story, the characters, the battle system, the music, all of it is just outstanding. I was so tempted to just keep playing when I was capturing for this video, as my memories of Phantasy Star 4 just started taking over. And that means that the Genesis Mini is doing a great job, isn't it? If you like RPGs and you haven't played Phantasy Star 4 yet, you need to. Now, if only Sega could get us a new traditional Phantasy Star game. There's still time. Make it happen, Sega. Next, Road Rash 2. Another game included out of the Mini that came out of nowhere, Road Rash 2 is probably the most solid entry in the series to include from EA's classic racing brawler hybrid. Though I think I would have preferred Road Rash 3, Road Rash 2 is still a fun game after all these years. And you know, it's crazy just how well the Road Rash games still hold up today. Hell, they hold up much better than the 3D games to come later in the franchise. What else can I say? Good job, EA, for letting us jump on the speed bikes and have a go all over again. You know, we really could use a new Road Rash game right about now. Next, Shining Force. My favorite strategy game series of all time just had to be included on Genesis Mini, as in my opinion, it is a prime example of a grid-based strategy RPG that nearly anyone can pick up and play. Couple that with a thrilling cinematic battle sequences and excellent soundtrack, and you have a strategy game for the ages. Yeah, I would have preferred Shining Force 2, but this was still an excellent choice for Sega to include on the Mini. However, the Asian version of the Mega Drive Mini does include Shining Force 2. Why only there, and I have no idea, but lucky them. Next, Shinobi 3. Shinobi 3 is one of the most rock-solid action games on the Genesis, so it certainly deserves its place on the Mini. It's a beautiful action game that plays silky smooth and has some of the most coolest sequences of any ninja game, like the stage where you're riding a horse. So damn cool. Also, dig that soundtrack, it is absolutely outstanding. It's sad to see that my favorite Shinobi game, Shadow Dancer, got skipped for the Mini, but you know, if Sega had to pick the best overall Shinobi game here to appeal to a wide audience, I think it's the right choice. Though it's kind of strange that the Western Genesis Mini got Shinobi 3, while the Japanese and Asian versions got The Revenge of Shinobi. I wonder why. Next, let's go for a twofer here, Sonic the Hedgehog and Sonic the Hedgehog 2. It's Sonic. The hog, the myth, the legend, and he plays and sounds pretty much perfectly here. No complaints from me. And the same could be said for Sonic 2. Do I really need to go too far into detail here? You already know about Sonic, but it's great to see them get the gameplay right this time around. But next up, Sonic Spinball. Probably one of the most polarizing games to be included on the Mini. I use that word often when I talk about Sonic games, huh? But my personal soft spot for Sonic Spinball holds no bounds. I stick up for this game, mainly because if you really sit down, give it a chance, you can see just how imaginative and fun the table designs really are when you give it a bit of patience. Which, yeah, I'm aware of the irony of having patience with the Sonic game, but bear with me here. But I also feel it's a good choice for the Genesis Mini because there just aren't any other games quite like that on the system. So, love it or hate it, to me, it fits. Next up, Space Harrier 2. I've always wondered why the original Space Harrier never got a release for the Genesis, but it got a straight to console sequel, so it's all good. The OG of endless running shooters lives on here in the Genesis Mini with a pretty faithful sequel. However, the 3D effects here really do kind of show their age here in 2019, especially when you get to the stages with the dual floor effect. Still a classic though. Next, Street Fighter II Special Champion Edition. The game that many naysayers of the Genesis back in the day said couldn't be faithfully done arrives here on the Genesis Mini in its full 24 mega power glory. I never really had an issue with either this or the port of Super Street Fighter II on the Genesis. I always thought they were well done, scratchy vocals withstanding. But that being said, you will need one of the 6-button controllers if you really want to play this on the Mini properly, so keep that in mind. Next up, Streets of Rage 2. The greatest beat 'em up of all time in my eyes, and personally my favorite game on the console. Yes, more than Sonic. Streets of Rage 2 has always been a tricky one to emulate on previous compilations and microconsoles, but I'm pleased to say that here on the Mini, it's pretty much perfect. The music, the incredible soundtrack, sounds accurate, the sound effects and voices have the right pitch, and the game plays like a dream. This is probably the game I've played through the most times in the Genesis library in my lifetime. Anytime I fire up Streets of Rage 2, I can't stop. Next, Strider. I flipped out when Sega's excellent rendition of Capcom's Strider was announced for the Genesis Mini. And why wouldn't I? It's one of my favorite action games ever, and it was ported extremely well to the Genesis. It's still kind of hard to believe that this was an early title for the system. Absolutely excellent choice for a platformer that is truly one of a kind. This really was one of the best examples of how back in the day, Genesis did what Nintendo didn't. Next up, Super Fantasy Zone. Another choice that came out of left field is Super Fantasy Zone never got a release in the US, which is strange considering how Opa Opa is kind of a Sega staple. I know Fantasy Zone can be a real hit or miss with people, but I've always been a fan of it. It essentially is what the title of the game is, a souped up version of the trippy and colorful shoot-'em-up that we mostly know and love. Nice choice. Next, Mega Drive Tetris, and whoo boy, we're going to talk about this one a bit. When I saw the Japanese live stream that Sega did when they announced that the Mega Drive version of Tetris was going to be on the Genesis Mini, I was floored. For those that don't know, here's a quick history lesson. Sega made an official Mega Drive port of their 1988 arcade version of Tetris, only for the game to be pulled from release due to licensing issues from a certain other company, and was allegedly only around 10 physical copies of the game are known to exist within the world. I had played a ROM of the Mega Drive Tetris game years ago on an emulator, so I'm fairly familiar with the port. So when I fired it up on the Genesis Mini, something felt off. There are no options or anything, just press start and go straight into the action. Free play? What's that about? Then I realized what Sega and M2 did here after firing up my Sega Ages 2500 Tetris collection on the PS2. Looks like they opted to port the arcade version of Tetris to the Mini and not the Mega Drive version. Check it out! Why though? It's not like the arcade version was so superior as they're almost identical, but the Mega Drive version had more options. Plus, this is the Mega Drive Mini and all. Yeah, it just seems like an odd choice. Maybe Sega lost the original ROM, or maybe they don't have the rights to it, or who knows. Itself plays fine. It's Tetris. But to be honest, even after playing the Mega Drive version of Tetris, it might be rough for some after all the modern updates to the classic game. No lie folks, Tetris DS and Tetris 99, they kind of spoiled me. But regardless, it's a really cool thought at least. Next up, Thunder Force 3. The classic and iconic shoot-'em-up series Thunder Force needed to have the game on the Genesis Mini, and I can see why they picked Thunder Force 3. It's probably the most well-rounded of the series, even if I found it to be a little easy. Thunder Force 2's vertical stages drag on a bit, and Thunder Force 4 was recently made part of the Sega Ages Switch collection, so it makes sense. Though I would have rather had Thunder Force 4, and I've already gushed about how much I love it in a previous video, Thunder Force 3 is still a quintessential shoot-'em-up that deserves its spot on the Genesis Mini. Next up, Toe Jam and Earl. The funkiest duo to ever grace the Genesis, it's good to see my favorite gaming aliens wrap their way onto the Genesis Mini. ToeJam and Earl is a tough game to explain in a short fashion, so I'll put it like this. You explore Earth looking for pieces of your broken spaceship so you can get back to planet Funkatron, while avoiding the wackiest bunch of Earthlings and opening presents that give you power-ups. And when you play the game in 2-player, the screen splits when you get separated so you can cover more ground and come back together when you're close. It was a really cool thing at the time. It's actually one of my favorite games to play in multiplayer on the Genesis. So many memories of playing it with my sister when we were growing up. It's so awesome to see ToeJam and Earl make a comeback nowadays, so you absolutely should give this a whirl on the Genesis Mini. Next up, Vector Man. Vector Man was one of the last big mascot type characters to come around for the Genesis, but unfortunately he didn't really catch on. It's a shame because the game is a lot of fun. It's a super fast-paced action platformer with a unique art style that's unlike any other on the Genesis. Maybe it just came around too late in the 90s for people to care as much on the Genesis as people were gearing up for the next generation. Vector Man is a super solid platformer, but it never really wowed me. But it's good to see him make it to the Mini though. Next up, Virtua Fighter 2. I know a lot of people cried foul when the Genesis rendition of Virtua Fighter 2 was announced for the Mini, and I feel that's kinda harsh. Even with the technological downgrade, if you play this version and you're familiar with the arcade hit, you may be pleasantly surprised at how much it actually feels like Virtua Fighter, even though it's only 2D. That being said, it's one of the weaker choices for the Mini, but I respect how hard Sega tried to condense the game down into a neat little 16-bit package. Next up, Wonder Boy and Monster World. Wonder Boy and Monster World is a fine 2D exploration platformer. However, with the inclusion of the superior Monster World 4 on here, the downsides of Wonder Boy really show, like its slow pace and kinda average story. I also understand its importance in the life of the Genesis, but I also feel that they could have skipped this game in favor of something different. In fact, there are plenty of other games that I can think of that probably should have been included. Maybe 10? And finally, World of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck. Rounding out the Mini's package is what I feel to be one of the most fun co-op games on the Genesis. You can't have Castle of Illusion without World of Illusion. Plus you get to play as Donald Duck, my favorite Disney character, and that's always a plus. But the real meat of the game is in its 2-player co-op mode, where you have to work together to solve puzzles and get through the stages. This is another game that my sister and I used to play hours together when we were kids. And just like its prequel, the game is gorgeous, the level design is top-notch, and it's still a blast to play today. Overall, the Genesis or Mega Drive Mini's lineup is incredibly strong with very few filler titles. And that's not even including the games that were included on the Japanese and Asian releases that we didn't get, like Yu Yu Hakusho, Musha, or Alien Soldier. But no matter which version you get, this really could be the strongest retro microconsole to date. And that's not me saying that as a Sega fan. With N2 doing a mostly bang-up job on the emulation, strong marketing behind it, the right care with the look and feel of the product, Sega truly brought their A-game here with the Genesis Mini. It may have taken a few years, but it warms my heart to no end that Sega finally got it right.
So yeah, that's the Sega Genesis Mini for you, and what else more can I say, folks? This thing is amazing. Just the game library is excellent, the game playback is fantastic, the look and feel is awesome. And to me, whether you're a casual Sega fan, somebody who's curious and never really got on with the Sega Genesis, or even a hardcore fan like me, this thing hits on so many levels, and honestly, it is absolutely G approved. I can even say that it's the strongest micro console to date, but I'll save my thoughts for that a little bit later. I mean, we also got the Konami TurboGrafx 16 Mini coming out too, but I mean, as I said before, you should definitely go and pick one of these up because the Sega Genesis Mini is G approved. So what are your thoughts on the Sega Genesis Mini? Let me know in the comments below, or you can talk to me on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, folks, you know what to do. Like, share, subscribe, and of course, keep on gaming and keep being awesome. I'm G, and I'll see you on the next level.